All right. Good evening and welcome. My name is Pat Kowitzel. I'm the Hire and Author Program Coordinator at Magic City Books in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for the virtual book launch for Scott Ellsworth and his new book, The Groundbreaking. Here's my copy right here. All of you have a copy coming to you as well. Either it is on its way to you through the U.S. Postal Service and on its way that way, or you've decided to have it to pick it up in the store. And if that's the case, then you can come down to Magic City Books and pick up your copy. We really appreciate your support and purchasing this book. This is one that you're going to want to start reading immediately. And those of you that have already picked it up, I'm sure you have started reading it already. And I don't think you're going to put it down until you finish it. This is a really important book about our community in Tulsa, but also about, the country as a whole. And we're going to talk about that tonight. Magic City Books has a lot of programming coming up related to the Race Massacre and the Centennial commemoration that we're all kind of right on the cusp of. And so go to magiccitybooks.com and check out all of those upcoming programs. We've got a number of them over the next couple of weeks, and we really hope that you will continue to join us for more of these programs. And check out the programming that is available, within our city as well. There's a lot that is in person, and there's a lot that's going to be virtual or a combination of virtual and in person. And so make sure that you're checking those things out. There's a lot of programming that's coming, not only in these 2 weeks, but in throughout the entire summer. I know that there's a lot of things that are going on. And so through the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission or the Black Wall Street Rising Festival, there's a lot of great things that are celebrations and also, somber occasions as well, commemorating the events of 100 years ago. So tonight we're here to talk about the groundbreaking, and I wanted to just spend a second to read from the jacket of the book, because I think that this kind of sets the stage a little bit. A riveting and essential new book, The Groundbreaking, not only tells the long suppressed story of the notorious Tulsa Race Massacre, it also unearths the lost history of how the massacre was covered up and of the courageous individuals who fought to keep the story alive. Most important, it recounts the ongoing archaeological and true crime saga of the search for the unmarked graves of the victims of the massacre and of the fight to win restitution for the survivors of their families. Both a forgotten chronicle from the nation's past and a story ripped from today's headlines, The Groundbreaking is a page-turning reflection on how we, as Americans, must wrestle with the parts of our history that have been buried for far too long. This is just, this is the first event. This is the book launch for The Groundbreaking, but this is a book that we think is going to be on bestsellers all summer long and continue to just be read not only here in Tulsa, but by Americans, from coast to coast, and something that is really shining a light on the events that happened in Tulsa 100 years ago, but also what's happening today and as the search continues. Tonight, we are joined by a special guest moderator, Lee Hawkins, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And Lee covers education and the effects of the coronavirus pandemic on children and families. And he's author of the forthcoming book, Nobody's Slave, from How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free, coming out later this fall from HarperCollins. Thank you all very much for being here. Please post your questions in the Q&A tonight, and we will get to as many as possible. And I will hand it off now to Lee and Scott. Lee?
Thank you very much. Scott, so good to be here with you today. Just an astonishing book, a truth-telling book in a time in America where we need more truth. And, there's the old saying, the truth will set you free. But I think that there's a contingent in this country that actually believes that the truth is a negative thing. To mention slavery, to mention Jim Crow, or any act of racial violence is by some people considered an act of violence in itself. And so it's very important as we talk about our past and the legacy of this country and the fact that America, for all but 57 years of its existence, has been a country where white supremacy was the law and codified into the laws of this nation. It's very important that we establish that framework when we talk about history. And I think your book is a very, very just vivid recollection and just a masterfully researched piece of evidence, not just a book, but it's really evidence that is important for people to absorb before they even talk about race in this country. So first of all, I know you're a native of Tulsa, and I wanted to ask you how you came up with the idea to do this book. How did it happen?
Wow, that's a well. First of all, Lee, thanks so much for agreeing to do this tonight. I really admire your work, and I'm looking forward to your book coming out in the fall. You know, I guess a couple things to say from the outset. One is just to remind people that the Tulsa, you know, we call it the Tulsa Race Massacre today. It's had different names over the years, but it was the single worst incident of racial violence in all of American history. Okay, in all of American history. This is in the course of 14 to 16 hours, more than 1,000 African-American homes and businesses were looted and burned to the ground by a white mob with the assistance of members of Tulsa's police force, also the local all-white National Guard units. You know, you had 10,000 people were made homeless and were made homeless for some time. We know that there were hundreds that received medical attention, but to this day, we don't know how many people died. You know, the reasonable estimates go from probably in the 70s to as high as 300. But in all frankness, we don't know whether that number is 77 or 299. Tulsa was the first American city that was bombed from the air. We have solid evidence that at least one of the airplanes that was over Tulsa during the morning of June 1st dropped sticks of dynamite on Greenwood. Greenwood was, in fact, destroyed on the ground. But you know, this happened. The property loss, the financial loss is even to this day difficult to calculate. You know, there's in next month's National Geographic, the massacre is the cover story. The folks there estimate that the amount of generational wealth that would still be in Tulsa, in Greenwood, had the massacre not happened, would be the equivalent of $600 million today. I mean, that's generations of college tuition, down payments on houses, seed money to build, you know, to create new businesses, health insurance, on and on and on. And so this event, I think it's very important to remember, and I want to establish this from the beginning. This isn't just a Tulsa event or an Oklahoma event. This is an event of national importance and national significance. Okay. With that in the background, so, you know, hi to all my fellow Tulsans, hi to everybody from around. So I was born and raised in Tulsa. For the local folks, St. John's Hospital, Lee School, Wright Junior High, Central High School. My own family history just goes back in the 1930s in Tulsa. My dad was a petroleum geologist. I grew up, you know, in the oil industry. But so we didn't have anyone in the 1920s living here. But when I was a kid in the 60s, and even when I'm 10 and 11 years old, I would occasionally hear people talking about the massacre. But when you go into the room, they'd change the subject or lower their voices. And you just couldn't find out anything about it. I heard stories, these what I thought were what I would have thought was urban legends at some point about bodies floating down the Arkansas River. I grew up 5 houses from the river. Machine guns being on top of buildings downtown, airplanes and all that, but there was no way you could find anything out about it. And there's no way I could find out anything until the summer I turned 12 years old. It's the summer of 1966. I have my 2 best friends, Mark Walker and Cliff Cronk. And, you know, we mowed lawns and stuff, but we didn't have any jobs yet. And so we would just screw off all summer. We'd go downtown, sneak into construction sites, go to movies, mess around, get in trouble, all that stuff. And we'd often always end up at the brand new Tulsa City County Library downtown, beautiful brand new building. And you could listen to records on headphones and, you know, stuff like that. And one day we went in there and we saw something we had never seen before. And that was a microfilm machine. And man, we were determined to use it right from the start. So we head over there and we're starting to fiddle with the knobs and doing all this. And this librarian comes marching over, and she was brilliant. And because rather than shoo us away, she said, okay, I'm going to teach you boys how to use this properly. And she did, and explained it all, how it worked. And there were all these cabinets there that had all these rolls of microfilm, boxes of microfilm. And somehow I knew, and I think I know why I knew this, that the massacre had happened in June of 1921. So the first reel that we put in was the June 1921 Tulsa World. And as we're rolling through, we see these headlines and we can't believe them. 100 killed in the city, martial law declared, fighting raging. And we were just flabbergasted. We weren't, we didn't have the wherewithal to make sense of all of it, also to understand 1920s writing. But I knew at that point that something had happened.
Yes, you knew it at that point that it had happened. And I guess that little boy experience probably led to the first book that you did on this subject. So a lot of people read that, so it's still in print. So can you go further and explain how this book is different?
Well, this book is different for, a few reasons. So Death in a Promised Land, the first book, and I'm proud to say has been in print for 39 years. It was, I would describe as the first comprehensive history of the massacre. And I have to tell you, it didn't get a lot of attention in the press at the time, but it kind of had an impact on its own. It was also for a while the most stolen book out of the Tulsa City County Library system. Even the branch copies would get stolen. So once a year, I just sent them a box of books. But, a lot has happened, Lee, since 1982. And I've been involved, with the Tulsa Race Riot Commission 20 years ago. We learned a lot more things, and there was just a lot more to tell. But I have to tell you honestly, I'm rambling on with these stories, but they take a little while. I had not planned on writing the groundbreaking, and I had completed a new book, and I was searching for a new topic. And to go back again to my childhood years, I think everything happened when I was 12. During the 7th grade, when I was 12 and 13, I had a elementary school classmate and Little League teammate from Lee School named Jackie Gresham. And Jackie ended up not going on to junior high school, but he was held back, went to another elementary school. But that year, Jackie Gresham, he grew up, his family, the marriage had broken apart. He had a couple of older brothers who I think were maybe a little wild, maybe not. My sense is he wasn't supervised a lot. And one night that year, Jackie snuck out of the house to go to a party, like at, midnight or 2 a.m. And there was a pedophile at that party. And the pedophile attempted to sexually assault Jackie in a bathroom. Jackie fought back, and the pedophile killed Jackie. Now, as you can imagine, for my 12-year-old set, this was just a gigantic event. I'd had a grandparent die, but I'd never known anyone who had died other than that. And what was amazing about it is that our parents, rather than try to sugarcoat things to us, they just told us the truth. I mean, sexual assault was something you didn't read in the newspapers in Tulsa in those days. People didn't talk about rape or pedophilia, any of that. And that his murder had always haunted me. And I thought maybe I could write a book that uses his murder to talk about how 1960s culture, different freedoms and stuff, how it kind of landed in conservative middle America. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but I was, coming back to Tulsa a lot, looking at the old police files, things like that. And it was at that point in early 2019 that Amy Brown, the deputy mayor of Tulsa, called me up and asked about the first search for the mass graves 20 years earlier that had been shut down. And I ended up meeting with the mayor, and he asked me to head up the committee leading to that event. So I'm still kind of researching Jackie. I'm starting to do this, and my wonderful literary agent, David Larabelle, said to me on a Friday, said, why don't you do a book about both of those things? Maybe about your search for Jackie's death, killer, whatever, and the search for these mass graves. I thought that's kind of a weird idea, but it might work. And then by 24 hours later, I said, no, I've got to write this story about how the massacre was covered up for 50 years, how it was uncovered. And because I've been doing this for so long, I realized there's not many people who knew the story. I might be the only one. And so I said, no, I have to write this book, else that subject is going to get lost.
Yeah, and you do get into the destruction of paperwork and all of the news articles and the written evidence that was all just suppressed, and even the suppression of speech. And now you say that your first book is the most stolen book from the library. So how did you find primary sources and verify information you learned about?
Well, it took a lot of work, but I was really determined to do it. I had so I spent the first summer of 1975, when I was a 21-year-old college student. I decided to write my senior thesis about the massacre. I came back home to Tulsa that summer and collected information. So, I found what information I could, in newspaper articles, any government records that weren't stolen, any reports I could find, just anything that I could come up with. But I have to tell you, Lee, I had a big problem. And the big problem was I was having a hard time putting things together. And one thing I wanted to know was about this Greenwood business district and the community and what it looked like. I just didn't want statistics. And so I discovered something called city directories. And these were I discovered them, became familiar with them for the first time. They were like telephone books issued every year. And, they would list everybody, all the heads of households and their spouses. They'd list all the businesses and all that in Tulsa, and they're big, thick books. And I was looking at them, and I realized about every 10th listing, there was a lowercase c in parentheses. I thought, what the heck does that mean? And then I realized it meant colored, which meant an African-American person. And then I thought, oh, I can take these city directories, and it would list all the streets and everything at the addresses. And I could make a portrait of this Greenwood business district. So I went to the city engineer's office. I got these maps, and I kind of taped them all together, old plat maps, street maps of Tulsa from 1920. And then I went to the city directories, and I wrote down what was at every address. So and what happened in doing that is the neighborhood came alive. Oh, I could see, so the photography studio was right next to Mabel Little's Cafe. That was right next to the hotel. Upstairs, this family lived and all that. And it just wasn't a bunch of numbers, and it came to life. But as that summer went on, I still had a problem. I couldn't figure out how you had this seemingly nothing incident in an elevator turn into this racial Holocaust. And near the end of the summer, I met a woman named Ruth Avery. She was a friend of my mother's best friend. And Ruth had been about 7 years old at the time of the massacre. And a flatbed truck piled high with the bodies of African-American massacre victims drove right in front of her house. And she saw this as a 7-year-old, and it made this huge impact on her. And sort of as an amateur historian, she was determined to kind of save the history of the massacre over the years. And she was very supportive of me. And I said, hey, Ruth, Ruth said, how's it going? I said, it's not going that good. I can't figure out how this thing happened. I mean, how do we go from this elevator incident to this deal? And she said, oh, you ought to go see W.D. Williams. And I said, well, who's he? And she said, he's a retired high school teacher at Booker T. Washington High School. He was a teenager during what we call the riot, and you ought to go see him. Well, it turned out W.D. Williams was from, Tulsa's. He was Greenwood royalty, Tulsa royalty. His family owned
He did know Dick Rowland, didn't he?
Well, actually, it was another guy who knew Dick Rowland, but that knew him well. But Williams, their family owned the Dreamland Theater. They owned a garage. They owned the Williams Building, all that. So I call him up and say, can I come and talk to you? And he said, yeah. And I'd never done an oral history interview. I didn't really know what to do, but I came over, he invited me into a nice home on Reservoir Hill. we sat down at his kitchen table, and I'm kind of explaining who I am and what I want to do. And he's a little stiff to me at first. And I'm thinking, shoot, this was a mistake. This guy doesn't know anything. I'll just try to figure out how to politely, end this. And then I remembered my maps. So I pulled out of my pack these maps. I'd written down all these things, and we spread it out over his kitchen table. And he bends over it, and he's starting to shake his head, and he's moving his finger along every single entry I made on these maps. And he's starting to get a smile, and he's looking at it. And I realized this wasn't a map of the Greenwood commercial district. This was a map of his boyhood. And there were people he hadn't thought about in 60 years. And all of a sudden he lifted up his face, looked at me and says, "Okay, tell me what you want to know." And that for me was the big breakthrough. It was supposed to be an hour interview. We talked for 4 hours. And for the first time ever, I could understand how the massacre happened, because Mr. Williams had been at all the right places at the right time. He had read the Tulsa Tribune with the 2-lynch Negro editorial. He had seen a black vet jump on the stage of the Dreamland Theater and say, "We ain't going to let this happen here. There's not going to be a lynching." He'd seen the black vets gather and all that. And then all that night of May 31st, June 1st, he had helped his dad load and reload his father's 30-30 rifle and repeating shotgun to keep the whites from invading. And then when the thousands of them came the next morning, he fled and saved. But that was the moment that the massacre was saved, in my opinion, or knowledge of it. And we would not know today what happened if it hadn't been for people like W.D. Williams. And also 3 summers later, I came back to turn the thesis into a book. And he introduced me to in the summer of 78, other massacre survivors who were all adults in 1921. And it's, and God bless them. I mean, with the exception of Williams and one other, none of them had ever been interviewed before. I was probably the first time they spoke about this outside their family. And I salute their courage. And that's really why we know what happened.
Yeah, and it's really powerful that you were able to do this on the timeline that you did, because there were still living survivors. And without those accounts, that history would be gone. I think there was a saying, I think it was Alex Haley, that said, when an elder dies, it's like a whole library burned down. And is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it was just luck. It was just, God or somebody, whatever. But, because 20 years later that we had survivors, and I got to know many of them, but they were all children during the massacre, and they didn't see the things that adults could see. So I would, if you use the library idea, I was the last lucky patron to check out those books. And thank goodness I was able to.
And I just want to back up to something you said earlier about the planes dropping dynamite on the community. Do you have any sense of whose planes those were?
Well, we have a fair amount of work that we did on that, particularly 20 years ago. And if people are interested, they can look at the Tulsa Race Riot Commission report. And there's a chapter called Airplanes in the Riot. It's available online. There weren't many planes in Tulsa at the time. I think it was 6 or something like that. These are private planes or company planes. Typically, they're biplanes, 2 wings, open cockpits, maybe a pilot, maybe a passenger, flammable, material in general. There's lots of reports of the planes being over Greenwood on the morning of the 1st. And there are some reports, not a lot, but some talking about people seeing things dropped out of the planes. But it was always difficult to kind of sort through some of that. But 20 years ago, and I cannot remember the gentleman's name, Dick Warner, my assistant from the Tulsa Historical Society, and I interviewed an older white man who had a very specific memory of having his hair cut in a white North Tulsa barber shop in 1957. And as he's waiting for, and we looked up the barber shop and all that stuff, and he's waiting for to get his hair cut, there's an elderly white man who's getting his hair cut, and he's telling the barber and everyone in the barber shop about how on the morning of the riot, he and another man who had been pilots, they could have been World War I pilots, went and commandeered an airplane at the airfield, and they flew it over Greenwood, and that man dropped, a half dozen sticks of dynamite down on Greenwood during the riot and during the massacre. And the story was good to me for a couple of reasons. People talk about lighting a Molotov cocktail. You're not going to light a Molotov cocktail in an open cockpit where the wind is flowing by at 80 miles an hour. But they had waterproof fuses for dynamite in those days. You could light one of those fuses, throw it in a lake, and it won't go out and it'll blow up. And I could see somebody with a cigar in his lap or something like that, light one of those waterproof fuses and throw it out. And to me, that was a really powerful story because you had the evidence from the African American community on this, but now you had evidence from the white community too. And the only published reference to bombs being dropped on Greenwood, in the 1950s was this obscure but wonderful book by Mary E. Jones Paris, Events of the Tulsa Disaster. Less than 100 copies were printed. There were probably less than 50 copies in Tulsa. None of them were in the white community. This white man in the barbershop would not have read any of those things. So either he did this or he made it up out of full cloth. And I tend to believe that he actually did it.
And, the fact that you were part of the 1921 Race Riot Commission from 1997 to 2001, really, in addition to your book and all of that, makes you the foremost expert or one of the nation's foremost experts on this topic. And as you start to go through and go back to these events now in your book, you're talking also about some of the mass graves that have been found. And that means the story is still going and you have plans for that. So please, before we go back and talk about some of the other things, please talk about some of the present things, the mass grave and what that really means and the implications of that for the families and for the Tulsa community.
Absolutely. So I won't go into that whole history. I write about it in the book, but I initiated the search for the mass graves in 1998. And we did a lot of work. This is during the Riot Commission era. We interviewed over 300 Tulsans, survivors, eyewitnesses, descendants, cemetery workers, all of this stuff. We identified 3 areas in town where we were confident that massacre victims had been buried in unmarked graves while their loved ones were being held under armed guard during martial law. And we brought in ground radar and all that. And our first effort got caught up in the politics of the day and it was shut down. And then 2 years ago, Mayor Bynum asked me to start that again. And we added a 4th site. It's almost like 3+ sites. But in October of this past October, we discovered a mass grave in Oak Lawn Cemetery, city-owned cemetery at 11th and Peoria, where nobody was supposed to be buried. There were no cemetery records saying people were buried, but we had already learned from funeral home records that nobody had seen in decades that at least 18 identified and unidentified African-American massacre victims were buried in the cemetery by white funeral homes. So in October, we discovered 12 plain, simple pine box coffins lined up by 2s, at least 12. And we are convinced that these are probably 12 of those 18 victims. Regardless, we're convinced that these are massacre victims. So what will happen, we have to prove that, of course, but what will happen on June 1st is we're going to begin the exhumation of those remains. We have a terrific team of archaeologists, of forensic scientists, of osteologists led by Phoebe Stubblefield, who is actually a descendant. Her parents grew up in Tulsa, and Carrie Stackelbeck, who's the state archaeologist of Oklahoma. We're going to begin the exhumation process of those remains. They're very fragile. This will take several weeks, but hopefully we will be able to, learn a lot about them, gender, racial characteristics, age, cause of death. We will hopefully extract DNA, and we might be able to actually identify who these individuals are. But regardless of who we can identify or not identify, these people are going to be, in a way, proxy representatives of all the massacre victims. They need to be reburied with honor, hopefully somewhere in Greenwood, and to be memorialized, appropriately. In my mind, I'm hoping we have something along the lines of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier from Arlington Cemetery. But this is going to become a shrine, not only to the victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre, but to the thousands of victims of racist violence across America that lie in unmarked graves. So this is a solemn process, and it's an important one. These people were thrown away, and it's time to bring them back home.
And as we gather research in the history on so many of these tragedies, a lot of times it's lost the personal impact. And in my own research, I've studied a lot about the health consequences of racial violence and how it leads to early death. But in your research, the fact that these people were survivors meant that they were older. They were, at the end of their lives. So they survived, but did they really survive? Was there a PTSD? Was there a trauma? Tell me about the psychological and emotional wounds of racial violence for both survivors and then intergenerationally for the descendants that you've spoken with.
Sure, I'm happy to tell what I know. A little bit of it is anecdotal, but the massacre was such a horrific event, and I knew survivors in the 1990s, the late 1990s, that were still suffering from PTSD. There's just no question about that. And one thing that while the story of the massacre was actively suppressed in the white community, it was also not talked about publicly in the African American community either. And I think, and part of that is a result of this trauma, in that survivors like Holocaust survivors, World War II veterans, some others, they didn't want to burden their children and grandchildren with these, horrific memories of things that had happened to them. They often wanted to look to the future, but, a result of this is that the story was lost. There are descendants who are my age, I'm 67, who didn't learn about the massacre until they were in their 40s or 50s. I mean, because it was so, kept quiet. So that's certainly a response to that. There was a survivor I knew about in the 1970s, a gentleman who kept a loaded rifle by his front door, quote, in case it should happen again. And he was not alone in that. There were others that were fearful this horrific event could happen again. The kind of flip side of that, though, and you saw this in some survivors, is, despite the destruction that happened, there was a lot of pride in Greenwood after the riot, that we had fought back, and Black Tulsans fought back ferociously this invasion, and they were simply overwhelmed. There was pride in the fact that the community had rebuilt itself. And the vast majority of Black Tulsans didn't leave Tulsa. Many, some fled, and some fled for very good reasons, but many stayed, and they rebuilt their community. So on the one hand, you have people who were shattered by this, and I'm sure that there were health issues. I'm sure that there were things that, parents who were heartbroken that they couldn't provide for their children because they had lost everything and couldn't get it back again, all of this generational wealth that was lost. But there was also pride. It's very complicated, but there's no question, to quote one of my favorite authors, as William Faulkner said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And the Tulsa Race Massacre isn't over. It still casts a shadow on Tulsa, and it's a shadow we're still living under.
And is that why the mass graves and making sure that these people are memorialized properly needs to be done? Is that part of the healing that needs to take place?
I think so. It's also very sobering and somber when you realize you're dealing with the remains of actual massacre victims. Um, but look, the reality is this: none of us can live our grandparents' lives or our parents' lives. They lived in their era. They made their choices. They made their decisions. But our institutions are still with us. The people of Greenwood were let down by the city of Tulsa, by the state of Oklahoma. They were let down by the federal government, who'd never lifted a finger to investigate this horrific event. They were let down by the insurance companies that refused to pay these claims. And these institutions are still with us. And it's incumbent upon us to try to make amends for the wrongs that happened in the past. And I think this is part of the healing process. And this is not easy. You've had generations of Tulsans, and certainly generations of white Tulsans who born and raised here and who are older, who have never heard of this event. And to suddenly hear that the history of their city is much different, that's a shocking thing. It can be disturbing. Some people just want to wipe it away. Let's just keep it buried. Others are heartbroken and ashamed of it. But this is a process that, here's the irony. Oklahoma, as you may know, and certainly many of the listeners, it's this is one of the most conservative states in the nation. But ironically, the work that's going on now in Tulsa, in some ways, Tulsa is ahead of the rest of the country, because we have this deep, dark skeleton in our closet that we're trying to wrestle with. And the rest of the country is just getting used to that. We live in what I call the age of reevaluation, where statues are coming down, buildings are getting renamed. We're trying to figure out who our heroes are and who they aren't, and to finally have an honest look at our past. And folks in Tulsa have been doing that for a little while now.
Yes, they have. And it seems like there's still, however, debate going on about how to fix this, right? And how to reach a period of reconciliation, because some are arguing that you can't do that if you don't go through the truth and then the restitution phase, which sort of mirrors the broader argument that is being had in the nation over reparations. And so the Tulsa Commission that you sat on, you recommended reparations. And I wanted to know, 20 years ago, when they had the opportunity to do that, or some would say the obligation or the choice to do that, they didn't. They chose not to. And so what role does that play then in the healing process? Does that sort of harm the healing process? And what was the politics behind that? Why are people so reluctant to actually pay restitution to the many families that have suffered tremendous loss?
And this is a layered, complicated issue. And I think that anyone says that reparations is a complex issue, and I think you have to be upfront about that. And that being said, there's no question in my mind whatsoever that some form of monetary restitution is due to the 3 living survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre, but more importantly, to the descendants of massacre descendants. The Tulsa Race Massacre is a definable, finite event, okay? It's going to be hard, but it's not going to be impossible to figure out who the survivors were. We can get a good estimate of that. There are techniques you can use to find out who the descendants are. It's going to take some work, but it's something that needs to be done. So 20 years ago, 23 years ago, whatever, during the time of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, which was a state commission, I wasn't actually on the commission. I was hired by the commission to run the scholars group, and the scholars were all in favor of restitution. And the state of Oklahoma, they had an excellent opportunity to do something. At that point, we only had roughly 150 or so identified survivors. They could have even made a token payment of $10,000 to each of those people. Would have meant the world to those individuals and to their families. I was skeptical of reparations at first, but that generation of survivors in the 1990s convinced me otherwise, convinced me of their importance. And I've been a supporter of that. So we had this great possibility back then. And the state of Oklahoma walked away from that and instead gave the survivals a gold-plated medal. Look, reparations is a hugely divisive topic, mainly around racial lines in the state. And in Tulsa, you can look at the poll data on that. African Americans are overwhelmingly in support of them. White Tulsans are opposed, not all of them. But this is going to be a tough fight, and it's going to be a difficult issue. Guilt plays into it. The sense, well, I went around. I don't have anything to do with that. But the reality is that our history just doesn't die when it's over. If you look at simply the search for the mass graves, we have an outfit in the federal government that to this day has constantly sought to recover the remains of American servicemen that were killed in World War I, that were killed in World War II, as remains of GIs are found on Tarawa and Okinawa and Guadalcanal. They are brought home with honor and reburied in the States, giving their family some sense of closure. That's something that we do. We have paid some reparations in the past. The federal government paid reparations to Japanese Americans for the illegal internment and seizure of their property during World War II. So there are precedents for that, but it's going to be a difficult fight. I ultimately think the federal government is going to have to get involved in this, but there's an opportunity for Tulsans, both the city and county of Tulsa, but also private citizens to do something about this. I think it needs to be done.
Okay, let's back up here. You made a couple comments that I really think need a little deeper analysis on.
Lee, you're pressing my brain cells at this point. I'll make a point of trying.
The most recent thing was about federal government needing to potentially step in. And as you know, the federal government is now studying the possibility of reparations for slavery. And that's a very divisive topic on the federal level. And it's not just a GOP issue. It's not an issue. The resistance or the questioning isn't just coming from the GOP side. Yes, you've had Mitch McConnell say, well, we wouldn't know who to pay as a justification. But you've also had President Biden himself, who has really sort of been on the fence and never really offered any sort of clear answer. And as a matter of fact, he said, well, then we'd have to also look at Native Americans, which is also an issue in Tulsa. And then, so that's the first part. And then the second part was that you told me that you were initially skeptical yourself. So if somebody this close to the subject that has studied it with this level of depth came in before not knowing, can you demystify to people what some of the issues are and what were your initial objections when you walked in, and then you before you changed your mind? What were the objections that you had?
I guess I'll tell you a story. So the Tulsa Race Riot Commission was actually ignored almost entirely at first. And it was until the news of our search for mass graves that we began to get attention. But there was one of the early commission meetings, I remember seeing a local Tulsa TV program on it. And here you had the news reader reading stuff about the Riot Commission met today. And they had, one of those green screens behind it that said Riot Commission. And then it showed dollar bills fluttering. That this was only about money. It was only about money going to Black people, all of that. And what I wanted, what I was hoping is that I felt that the city, John O. Franklin once said, Tulsa lost its sense of honesty for 50 years. And I thought the most important thing, first of all, was for the city to have a reckoning with its past. Quit lying about the past. Let's talk about the past. And so that to me was more important at that point than reparations. But as I discussed this issue with the survivors, many of whom I'd known for years anyway. And it became clear to me that this was very important to them personally. And it wasn't necessarily the monetary amount, but it was the fact that the state government or the city government would pay it to them. I
Okay.
remember George Monroe, whose family lost their roller rink. They had a roller skating rink in Greenwood. They lost their home. You know, George hid under the bed in his family's room when white men came in and set the curtains on fire. He got out by the skin of his teeth. And for, you know, as he would talk to me about that, I realized, no, there's a deeper emotional and moral issue here. So I changed my mind and, you know, got on the train.
Okay, but I do think it's important that you're showing now the level of sort of balance that you brought into this, that you came into it and it was through getting more enlightened and getting more facts on the table that you were able to change your mind. I think that's really fascinating. I have more questions, but I'm going to take a break here and ask one of the questions from one of our viewers here. Here's a question that came in from Rob. He says, Ed Wheeler told a little of the pressure he faces to suppress the story of the massacre when he was writing his 1971 story. Do you have any other stories of how the story was suppressed in Tulsa?
Sure. Oh, yeah. And I write a lot about them in the book. And for those who don't know, and I know Ed and I like Ed quite a bit and respect him. We don't always see eye to eye on a lot of things, but he's a great guy. You know, Ed had his life threatened, you know, for researching the history of the massacre in the winter of 70-71. Phone calls at his house all night long. He was approached on the streets of downtown Tulsa by strangers who came up to him, and Ed is white, incidentally, who said, "Don't you write that article?" He stepped out of his front door of his house in Brookside one morning. There was a dead chicken on the doorstep. Another morning, there was a note on the front windshield of his car which said, "Best check under the hood the next time," meaning that they're going to bomb his car. And, you know, and Ed put up with a lot, but there are others. Nancy Feldman is an incredible Tulsan, originally from Chicago, married a young Tulsa World War II vet who she met at the University of Chicago Law School, moved to Tulsa, came here and to make it her home. She ended up teaching at the University of Tulsa in the late 40s. And Nancy had been a championship swimmer back in Chicago, and in fact, a national champion. And she was, you know, with dreams of swimming in the next Olympics till she broke her back. But she ended up meeting a man named Robert Fairchild that was very helpful to me. And Robert Fairchild was the only African-American sort of supervisory employee of the Tulsa Parks Department in the late 40s. But he was important to me because he worked with Dick Rowland and knew Dick Rowland. And he had survived the riot. And he told this story to Nancy, who was from Chicago. And she was just flabbergasted, couldn't believe it. So in her class the next day at TU, and TU was all white at that point, all local white kids who had grown up in Tulsa. And she said she met this gentleman who told her about the massacre, and all of her students said, "What are you talking about? Nothing like that ever happened here. You're lying." And she said, "Well, of course it did. Ask your parents." And so they went and asked their parents, and they came back to class 2 days later, and their parents said, "No, nothing ever like that ever happened here." And she was just flabbergasted. So she brought in Robert Fairchild to speak to her TU class in 1948 or so. And that's getting pretty dicey on the color line in Tulsa at that point. And he told the students what happened, his experiences. And that wasn't the end of it, because her dean then called her in and said, "If you ever do this again, we're going to fire you." And Nancy later said that wasn't the most chilling thing. The most chilling thing to her was the fact that her Tulsa students, who would have all been born in, let's say, about 1930, they had grown up with no knowledge of this at all. So already it had just, the memory had been wiped clean in the white community. There were also, people I grew up with, kids at Lee School, one whose mother told me that when she and her husband moved to Tulsa in the 1950s from a small town in Kansas, they had heard of the massacre. And she brought it up at a party and she said, you could have heard a pin drop. And people said, we don't talk about that here. And she was just known this wasn't a subject. So certainly this was something that that wasn't to be talked about.
And as a white man, you're delving into a subject that even today, even though everybody's dead and nobody can be brought to justice for any crime that they committed, that people are still very hypersensitive and not talking about it. What is that about? And will we ever be able, is there going to be a point where we can actually get past it so American history can be taught in classrooms truthfully?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, the Civil War hasn't exactly ended either. So we still have difficult subjects, but I think it's, there's this new bill and I have not read the bill, so I'm going to plead some ignorance, but you have to teach hard subjects at age appropriate level. The school children of Oklahoma, believe me, I went to Wright Junior High. They're not a bunch of snowflakes. They're not a bunch of robots. They can handle subjects like slavery, the Tulsa Race Massacre, the Trail of Tears. The only way we're going to learn about our history is to, of course, you want to talk about the good parts. America's made great, contributions to world culture. There are many things to be proud about, and we want to teach those, but you also have to teach about our failings and the difficult subjects as well, too. That's the only way we can learn from doing this. There's a lot of resistance still to it. When we did the first excavation for the mass graves, our first dig was a failure in July, also at Oaklawn Cemetery. And I remember a older white woman who came marching up to the fence. I was talking to people about what's going on, and she said, "Is this my tax dollars that are taking care of this?" And I said, "Well, I said, actually, not many of them. Almost all of us are volunteers, and we were." And she kind of huffed and walked away. And then a photographer for the Tulsa World came up to me and he said, I've been on searches for the remains of murder victims. There's a very famous couple of young teenage girls that were murdered, white girls that were murdered in Welch, Oklahoma, 20 so years or so ago. There've probably been 50 digs to try to find them. They've all failed at this point. And he says, never does anyone ever criticize that. They only criticize when you're looking for massacre victims. So clearly the massacre still hits sensitive subjects, sensitivities in the Black and white communities, and there's still resistance to talking about it. But look, again, our history is only valuable if we learn from it all. And,
right.
and you just can't, how are you going to teach Pearl Harbor or 9/11 without making some people upset? You have to do that. That's how it goes.
But even in the last week, there have been some really relevant pieces of news that have broken based on this conversation we're having right now. The Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission announcing Friday that it had removed Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt from his seat on the panel about a week after he signed a bill outlawing the teaching of some race and racism concepts in public schools. What are your thoughts on that decision, considering what you just said?
Well, I think again, I haven't read the bill, but from what I can tell, it's just ridiculous. It's just silly. Look, our history is what it is, and we have to face it honestly and squarely, and we have to teach it that way as well.
But I mean about the governor himself and him not being viewed as someone who could honestly sit on the commission holding this position. What do you think about that as the leader of the state?
Well, obviously it's unfortunate. I mean, I can tell you, square in the face, Lee, that I'm sure glad I'm not on that commission. And, I mean, there's a lot of people under a lot of pressure right now. I think it's unfortunate. I think this whole thing is a sideshow that does nothing to help with, the work that we still need to do. So no, I'm very disappointed in that, no question.
Yeah. Okay. Here's another question from Tanja Durant. Is it known how many Tulsans stayed and how many left Tulsa after the massacre?
The answer to that is no. Nobody's really studied it, and I think there's a way you could. One way is to count up all of the names in Greenwood in the city directories before the massacre and after the massacre. I think we could get a pretty good estimation of that. There's some famous people who fled, for good reasons. They had indictments about them, but here's my guess. I believe that the overwhelming majority, 90% is my guess, 85, 90% of the people stayed. And they were determined to stay, and they weren't going to leave, and they were going to rebuild their community. What's even more amazing is that the majority of adults in Greenwood, they worked in the white community at service jobs, as cooks, as maids, as dishwashers, ditch diggers and whatnot. They were not allowed to work in the oil industry. And these people, after white Tulsans had destroyed their homes and tried to kill them, 10 days later, they're going back into the white community to work in their jobs. That to me is just the guts it took to do that is astonishing. And
but this was a period in American history where racism was prevalent throughout the country. So where would they have gone?
Right. And how would they go? I mean, they didn't have any money. I mean, for working folks, they didn't have money to buy, tickets and to take off. So I'm sure some people left. My gut sense is not that many, not that high a percentage, but that's one of those subjects where people still need to do research. Research needs to be done.
Yeah, and when you think about this period in American history where so much racial violence was happening and the KKK was rising, do people understand that, or do they see this as more of an isolated incident? Of course, when you open the discussion, you talked about this being the most large scale and nothing being comparative to this, but more broadly across the nation, racial violence was an American phenomenon, right?
Absolutely. And certainly in the first book, Death in a Promised Land, I write about, a lot about the era, the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow laws, birth of a nation, lynchings, but especially about what everybody called in those days was known as a race riot. That isn't a term, a nefarious term. It's what everybody called them. The Chicago Defender, African American newspaper, called what happened in Tulsa the Tulsa Race Riot. So did white newspapers. And this meant that there was some sort of a racial incident happens that ends up in two things. One, that African Americans are attacked by whites in downtown neighborhoods, things like that, but also that white mobs invade Black communities, burning, looting, shooting. There were, dozens of these that happened right around the end of World War I and into the early 20s in Chicago, Washington, D.C., East St. Louis, elsewhere. And that what happened in Tulsa is a part of that group, but it's also it's just to a much higher level.
And I ask that question because there are many people who see this in a one-dimensional way, where they say this was the white people in Tulsa that were jealous of the Black people and the wealth that they were building. However, you clarified that compared to white wealth, Black wealth was small. But however, all of these service level people who were working in the white community were bringing their money back in to Greenwood to support the community. And so I think that that's a very important point to make, because it's a clarifying point, because it was really the racism of the country and this idea that the Black men who initially went to save Dick Rowland were primarily, many of them World War II veterans that were there to save another Black man against the backdrop of this reality of so many Black people being lynched across the country. Is that a fair assessment?
It is. And there was some jealousy, of course. I mean, there are going to be white people who just cannot stand it if a Black person has anything. And the idea that, there are lots of working class whites in Tulsa, but, the mob that invades Greenwood, from what we know, there were middle class people. There are all sorts of race, levels there. But you bring up a really important point. These 75 African-American World War I vets who went down to the courthouse, they're not trying to break Dick Rowland free. They're simply trying to guarantee that he gets a trial, even a rigged Jim Crow trial. That's astonishing to me. What's also astonishing is I bet none of these guys knew Dick Rowland. These are older guys. They've been off to war. They're not going to necessarily know this young teenager, but they were determined that an African-American is not going to get lynched in their town, in their home, and they're going to risk their lives, and some of them gave their lives to make sure that that didn't happen. And in fact, they were successful. Dick Rowland was not lynched. And I think that their story has been forgotten. To me, Lee, and I've said this to you before, they are like the farmers at Concord Bridge in 1775 that fired the shot heard around the world. They are there to defend the rule of law. And there needs to be the memorial we don't have, and I hope that there's an African-American veterans group somewhere, or even, the VFW or American Legion could take this on as a project. Let's build a memorial to those incredibly brave men and what they did. And it should be right downtown where the courthouse was.
Yes, and sort of holding America to the concept of becoming American.
Right. And they're American heroes, and we need to celebrate them.
But, and we're going to wrap up here, but I just, it's getting good. I just want to talk a little bit longer. The jealousy, was there jealousy towards them as World War I veterans? Because at that time, there was a great deal of stature involved with that.
Well, it certainly armed African Americans carrying Springfield rifles and wearing U.S. Army uniforms. That made a lot of white people very nervous, and it made plenty of them angry as well too. So there's no question about that. There's probably some jealousy, involved as well. Yeah. Sure.
There's a lot of folklore out there, and I don't want to give any fuel to it because I think that doesn't help the situation. But there is one burning question that I've always had for you that I haven't asked. And that's, what do you think happened on the elevator?
I think, I think Dick Rowland tripped. And I think for a couple reasons. One is that Robert Fairchild, who I interviewed, who knew Dick Rowland, who said he would have never been involved in an affair with Sarah Page. He wasn't that kind of a guy to hit on a woman anyway. He would have never have done that. There was also a survivor who told me that elevator, in those days, elevators, they weren't automatic yet, an elevator operator that did this wheel, and it was hard to get the floors to line up right. That's why whenever you get on an elevator that's operated by a person, you can still find them in New York and whatnot. They always say, watch your step, or in a movie, watch your step, because you get it off an inch and it's easy to trip. And there was a woman who said that particular elevator in the Drexel building was really hard to line up. So I just think there's no question that, that he tripped as he went on there. The police were summoned. They weren't super worried about it. They didn't put out an all points bulletin. They don't pick him up until the next day. So I think the evidence is strong that he simply tripped.
Okay, one more question.
And then I have a question for you after that.
Okay. The journalist in me makes me, one thing that I really get frustrated with, especially when I'm studying genealogy, is when you go up and you hit a wall, and you just have certain things that you may never know the answer to.
Sure.
And one of the things, that just fascinates me about this story is just the folklore about what happened to Sarah Page or what happened to Dick Rowland, and that nobody can answer those questions really in an informed way. And I wanted to know what you think of that, and then also what the burning question you still have is that keeps you up at night.
Okay, so we've tried, man. We have searched for Sarah Page and Dick
bet.
Rowland.
I can imagine.
Sarah Page just disappeared into the void, but that doesn't mean we won't find her someday. We'll just have to wait and see. Maybe a letter will come to surface. I mean, there are massacre photographs we've never seen before that have shown up in the last 2 years. So
These are in people's attics or what?
Yeah, people's attics, or people feeling I can share this now. I don't have to be ashamed that I have it, things like that. And I encourage anyone to have stuff to do that. I think that Dick Rowland I think he went out to the Pacific Northwest. I believe the stories that he was maybe working, maybe in a shipyard building Liberty ships during World War II, maybe in Portland or Seattle. He ended up there. We don't know. I would say for me, the burning questions are, on the evening of May 31st, after the violence has begun, we know that white men went around and starting to organize other whites for this dawn invasion of Greenwood. I'd like to know who those people were. There's a real question, and it's not a settled issue at all, as to whether the Klan was organized in Tulsa before the massacre. The evidence right now, I believe, says that they didn't organize until afterwards, but I'd like to know that for sure. So there are a lot of things that I'd like to know, but Lee, we've been having this appropriately very serious conversation here about this book, a lot of issues, divisive issues. But I want to hear from you. You read the book. What did you think of the book?
Like I said, I thought the book was astonishing. And I think the way that it touched me was to be able to make that connection between the past and the present, the issues that still are out there with the mass graves in particular, because I, in my own research, have run into some of the issues that you have run into with this sort of the resistance, the prevailing resistance, and people being split as to how much of this story should really be told, but then having this burning desire to want to expose as much as possible. And so I think the discussion of the mass graves and what it means to in the present day, and the role that could play in bringing some healing and some reconciliation is really important. And so,
Who should read this book? Who should read this book?
Well, I think kids, especially our college students and our high school students. And the reason I believe that is because, first of all, I'm a devout, I'm passionate, if not self-righteous, about teaching history and its truth. And there have been, I think it was Rand McNally with a textbook. They put out a textbook that referred to enslaved people as workers.
Right.
And this young Black boy brings the book home to his mother, who happens to be a PhD. And, she just said, this can't go. This is horrifying. And they changed it, and they brought it to her attention, but she brought it to their attention. But what does that tell us about the American sort of canon and the way that we process, not only teach, but also how do we process it, and what are the ramifications for the future? And so when I hear you talking, and everything that I've read, not just your book, but also the articles and things that are out there as well, suggests to me that the generation that really will probably be able to bring us to a phase of reconciliation and healing around this incident is yet to come. Like, this will be potentially the kids and their generation, no matter what side you're on. And I also believe that it is Well, I can tell you firsthand that there are people of all races and of all sides on this issue who feel that it was a tragedy. And so I think that's an opportunity as well. No matter where you come down on, the reparations issue, it's worthy of discussion and more dialogue, and also listening, right? Listening to the Black community. And that's what your book, both of your books have done, where you've gone and you've spoken to people, a lot of times people who wouldn't talk to you, right? And who you had to convince and you had to earn their trust. I mean, that as a journalist, to me, is a big challenge that it's most of the time we overcome the challenge, right? Because what do people want? They want to be heard, especially when they're holding these painful memories inside. And a lot of times they're telling you more than they've told their kids. And that's clear. That's another reason why I think people should read the book, because there's information that people didn't even find from their grandmother and their grandfather, and that those people took to their graves. So I really appreciate the opportunity to interview you. And I look forward to having this conversation more, because I think that it's only going to, in the Tulsa community, it's only going to grow in the curiosity, because there's some kid that was like you at Robert E. Lee School, similarly aged, who's going to have the same level of curiosity, and he won't be on the microfiche. He'll have more tools at his disposal, which is really encouraging. And for anybody who's a genealogy or a history geek, this is a topic worthy of studying for generations to come.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lee.
Yeah. And we want to thank everybody who listened in. Scott, what is your next event that you're going to be doing?
Well, that's a good, there's an event that's coming up later this week about the republication of Mary E. Jones Parrish's account of the Tulsa Race Massacre. That'll be coming up, I believe, on Thursday. And look, just to tell everyone out there, I know I've got some friends out there too, but you can find me. I mean, you just look me up at the University of Michigan. I'm happy to answer any questions or any things you all have to do. But I hope you enjoy the book. I wrote it for regular folks, and and I hope the story is one that'll captivate you. And I look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Scott Ellsworth, congratulations.
Thanks a lot, Lee.